International Law through KU's Political Science Department. And before teaching at KU, Amy practiced law for 2 decades in downtown Kansas City. She's active here politically as well as at the college, and we'd like to welcome Amy. Thank you.
Well, it's kind of funny that we introduced, because I'm going to introduce somebody. So, but anyways, it is my pleasure to introduce you to our speaker today, Mark Johnson. I've had the privilege of knowing Mark for 3 decades now. Can't believe that. Mark is a lawyer. He's a law professor and a former member of the board of the ACLU of Kansas, which is where I really got to know Mark. We were co-board members for a number of years, so many Saturday mornings spent together trying to save the world, right? So Mark.
And we did such a good job.
We did. Right? Here we are. Right? So Mark practices law at Dentons, a law firm in downtown Kansas City that he co-founded, and his practice includes cases involving voting rights, the First Amendment, marriage equality, election law, and campaign finance. What makes Mark so unique and valuable to our community, though, is the countless hours. And when I say countless hours, I'm not talking hundreds, I'm talking thousands of hours that Mark gives in his legal services, in filing lawsuits and filing cases, protecting things like voting rights. So Mark files lawsuits, he files cases to fight voter suppression. Then Mark litigates those voter suppression cases. Then Mark takes those voter suppression cases to trial, and Mark wins those voter suppression cases. So Mark we're so lucky to have Mark fighting many of those battles in our courts in Kansas. Mark is also a professor at KU. Mark teaches First Amendment law, campaign finance, and election laws. So Mark earned both of his degrees, or 2 degrees, I should say, from Yale and Harvard. So Mark is uber smart, and I swear every
Tell my wife that.
Every time I sit in a room with Mark Johnson, I walk away a smarter person. So it is my privilege to introduce Mark, and I can't wait for your program.
Thanks, Amy. All right, so one thing that you will find is that I wander. That's why podiums are kind of irrelevant to me. I walk, and that's why these things come in so handy. Now, one problem though is if you don't use them, like every so many minutes, they stick. And so, technology. See, usually I always have a plan B. Plan B is the projector. So I just took the hard copies off. There's no plan B here. Know your First Amendment rights. I'm going to do 3 things. First, tell you a little bit about the history of the First Amendment, because I feel that it's important to understand why we have it in the first place. It's for historical reasons. We have things happened mostly in the colonial era that the people who wrote the First Amendment said we don't want to have happen again. Same is true for other of the original 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights. So we'll talk a little bit about the history of the First Amendment, then talk about the structure of it, what's actually in it, and then talk about a number of the protections that are afforded to all of us. And by the way, the protections of the First Amendment, and this is true of all of the civil liberties we have, are extended to anyone in the United States. It's not limited to citizens. It's not limited to people who are here as immigrants legally. They extend to everybody in the United States, and of course the possessions of the United States. A lot of people these days are conveniently forgetting that fact. Okay, so this is the First Amendment. 45 words, that's all it is. I always kind of stun my students by saying the most important 45 words ever written in the English language. Because when they were written, of course, they applied to us, the people in the United States. But in the succeeding 240 or 30 years, however long it's been, since 1791, when the First Amendment went into effect, countries that include about half of the population on the earth have adopted the First Amendment. Now, as you can probably guess, they've done a better job grammatically. They've kind of taken it apart, maybe listed the rights, individually, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which we didn't do. But the reality is, countries like Russia and China and Vietnam, with which we fought a long and bloody war, have all, in rewriting their constitutions, copied our First Amendment. Of course, the real question is, do they follow? Do they walk the walk? First 5 words. Congress shall make. Now, back then, in 1789, when it was drafted, we had an entirely new Congress because the Constitution had just been adopted. And there was a feeling that the Congress didn't try to want to impose this on the states. We have the federal government and we have state governments that often disagree with each other. That's why we have this concept called federalism. So when it was originally written, it only applied to actions by Congress. It's been extended, don't worry about that, and I'll tell you how that came to be. 3 clauses. A lot of people say 5 protections. I really think there are 6. First clause, no state religion, and I'll tell you why. No established religion. Second is freedom of religion, freedom of belief. And the second clause, freedom of speech and of the press. I'll talk a little bit about how freedom of speech may be different from freedom of the press, but we can talk about the collective as freedom of expression. And then finally, the last clause has 2 additional protections. One is the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and the other is the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Only one of these protections was mentioned in the Declaration of Independence, which Thomas Jefferson wrote largely in 1776. And the Declaration is really nothing more, Jefferson being a lawyer, like Amy, it's nothing more than a legal brief. It's telling the English monarchy the reasons for our decision to detach ourselves from our mother country. All the terrible things that the king and his government had done or not done, as the case may be. And the only one that eventually found its way into the First Amendment is he ignored all of our entreaties. We petitioned the government because to redress the grievances we had, and he ignored us. So that's the only thing that's in the Declaration of Independence, 1776, that found its way into the First Amendment 13 years later, when it was written. Okay, so there is the basic 45 words. Not hard to memorize. Took me about a couple of hours to memorize it. I'd say it now, but I'd make a mistake, and that would be really bad. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the history of it. Why do we have it in the first place? Was it just somebody saying, hey, I think it's a good idea that we have something like that, and here are some ideas for what should be in it? Or was it somebody saying, lots of things happened in our history, and by our being going back to the start of the colonies, the 1600s? 1600s. Lots of things happened in England. The Brits experienced that we don't want to have happen here. And so the best way to do that is prevent it from even happening and then us trying to deal with it. We're simply going to say that the government doesn't have the power to deal with, with the issues that are addressed in the First Amendment. So, was it a quirk of history? No, it wasn't. There were reasons for it that I'll go through with you. Here's our idea, and some of you will recognize these famous Norman Rockwell paintings. In the 30s, 40s, and 50s, he did the covers for the Saturday Evening Post. Some of you may remember. This painting on the left is one of his Four Freedoms series. The painting on the right is largely the same thing. These are depictions of what we think is embodied in the First Amendment. The New England Town Hall meeting. Everybody gets up to talk. You see that these men clearly work for a living. Maybe they own a machine shop. Maybe they're farmers. They're people who work with their hands. But look, everybody is paying attention to them. The doctors and the lawyers in town, who come wearing suits, maybe they come straight from work, and they are watching him with rapt attention. By the way, Rockwell, he lived in Sturbridge, Stockbridge, Sturbridge. I always get them mixed up. Stockbridge, way in the western border, western end of Massachusetts, small town, and he used town residents as his models. This guy and this guy, same person, for whatever that's worth. But this is our ideal. Here's the reality. This is our good friends, the Phelps. You all know them. If you're like me, you've seen them within the past 3 weeks. I saw them demonstrating at a couple of the basketball games recently. If you go to the football games, every Saturday we have a home game. They're down at 11th and Mississippi on the corner with their signs. I've known the Phelps for a long, long time. They're all lawyers. And as lawyers, they're not bad. They're just a little wacky when it comes to espousing these principles that they have. But you can see here, not just the signs communicating a message, but the upside down flag. And I'm sure many of you know an upside down flag is a sign of an emergency situation. You may know that the Phelps basic message is that because, in their opinion, the U.S. government supports and advocates for homosexuality, which they oppose, God is punishing the United States by killing our soldiers. That's where you get these signs. But this is the reality of the First Amendment. This is really what the First Amendment is intended to protect, because it's easy to protect that. Everybody says, oh, this is wonderful. It's not so easy to protect that. And if we, then where do you go? You start here, and then the next thing, a little bit less objectionable, you prohibit that, and then here, and after a little while, you're standing here and you look over and you say, how the heck did that happen? It happens with baby steps, small changes, small regulations that the government imposes or would impose in the absence of something like the First Amendment. So, this is really what it's intended to protect. Okay. One point that's really important to understand is, what's free expression? A lot of people think it's just, hey, it's the right to say what I want to say. And that's absolutely true. But that's only half of the equation. The other half of the equation is that you don't get punished for saying what you want to say, or you don't think you're going to be punished. Because if you are afraid that if you say something that's unpopular, you're going to be punished for it. You don't say it. You're deterred from saying it. We call that the chilling effect. So as I go through the protections of the First Amendment, remember what free expression really is. And here's a concept that I really hadn't known about until 15, 20 years ago. There was a scholar named Alexander Meiklejohn in the mid-20th century. He was, among other things, he was a professor at Amherst, and he was the president of the University of Wisconsin over the course of his career. But he wrote a book, I think it's published in 1946, in which he sort of puts out this proposition. Free expression and democracy only exist with each other. If you don't have a democracy, there is no free speech. And if you don't have free speech, there can be no democracy. And you might say, well, that seems kind of extreme. But the thing that I would ask you to do is think about it. Can you think of a country that doesn't have freedom of expression as we think of it, that is a democracy? Or can you think of a country that's a democracy that doesn't have freedom of expression? And you see countries like Russia and China and many others that say they're democracies. But do they have freedom of expression? They don't. Because they're not democracies in the way that we think of them. They have what they call elections, but they're single candidate elections. They are elections where the result has been decided even before the voting occurs. Similarly, countries that don't have freedom of expression are not. According to Meiklejohn, and I've thought about this long and hard, and I can't come up with an example of a country without freedom of expression that's a democracy. So again, keep this concept in mind as we move through this discussion, asking yourselves, if we limit freedom of expression, can we remain a democracy? You, at this point, and many people do, I think incorrectly, you may think we're not a democracy because of some of the results of elections recently. I would disagree with that. Whenever you think Trump got more votes, Trump got more electoral votes, he was lawfully elected, just as Biden was lawfully elected in 2020. It's just that the folks on the other side didn't want to admit that. Keep these concepts in mind. Okay, a little bit about how we got the First Amendment in the first place. This is a painting that hangs in the rotunda of the Capitol in Washington, D.C. Huge, massive painting, I'd say 15 feet by 13 feet, maybe even bigger than that. And it depicts the final vote on adopting the Constitution in a room half the size of this room. That's Independence Hall in Philadelphia, same room in which the Declaration of Independence was adopted 11 years earlier. There were 42 people who voted, and many of them we all know. Of course, that's George, who was the presiding officer. That's where the word president comes from. When they were debating what to call this chief executive, John Adams proposed calling him Your Highness. While he thought, hey, look, John, we were kind of trying to put all this behind us. But when it got down to the actual discussion, somebody pointed at Washington as the presiding officer, president. That seems to make sense, and so that's where the word came from. So you have Washington standing here, and by the way, it was Washington's decision to come to Philadelphia that summer that really made this convention, it gave validation to this convention. His neighbors, and you remember he had the plantation in Mount Vernon, his neighbors included people like James Madison and James Monroe and Thomas Jefferson. And they worked on him for many months. George, you have to come to Philadelphia in May of 1787. For a long time he said, fellas, I'm finally getting Mount Vernon back into shape, where it's what it was before I went off to command the Continental Army in Boston in 1775. I've retired from public service. I don't want to get involved again. And they worked on him, and some events occurred, and he finally said, basta, I'll come. And that's what got everybody else to come. And who are the everybody else's here? You probably recognize Ben Franklin. He was there. But maybe you don't recognize Alexander Hamilton. This is classic Alexander Hamilton, kind of leaning in, whispering in Franklin's ear. Hamilton never held elective office. He was the first Secretary of the Treasury, but that's an appointive office. He was not the kind of person to be out front on things. He was kind of behind the scenes, kind of like the puppeteer, or the one pulling the strings. Adopting a new constitution, remember we had the Articles of Confederation, adopting a new constitution was Hamilton's idea. And then there's this guy sitting right here, and if you see the painting, he's sitting at a little table that you can pick up and move. That's Madison. James Madison, 5'4", 100 pounds, soaking wet, hypochondriac, didn't participate in the Revolutionary War, sat at home, pardon, I'm walking in front of the projector, sat at home at his plantation, Montpelier, over the course of the Revolutionary War, reading books. Voracious reader. They met 6 days a week. Madison sat at this little table every single moment of every single session, taking. I tell my students they are authorized to throw things at me if I talk about government having rights. Government doesn't have the right to do anything. It has power. And the statement of individual rights that George Mason was talking about was essentially a statement of what we as people can do in the face of government power. So, governments have powers, people have rights. And this Declaration of Rights that he was talking about was unprecedented. You can point to some documents in the distant past, the English Bill of Rights in 1689, but that only gave a few rights to the aristocracy. You can go as far back as Magna Carta in 1215, but that was simply an extension of rights by King John at the point of a sword, because about 20 or 25 members of the highest level of the English aristocracy said, John, you want to remain king? You've got to give us these rights. He wanted to remain king, so he gave up a few rights. There was a little bit of freedom of expression. The right of habeas corpus was first mentioned, but they only applied to these 20 or 25 barons in 1215. Some extension of that in 1689, but what we did in 1789 was unprecedented in human history. You may know that once the Constitutional Convention adopted the draft of the Constitution, it had to go out to the states to be ratified. And under the terms of the Constitution, 9 of the 13 states had to ratify before the Constitution would go into effect. And at that point, it would only go into effect for those states that had ratified. Anybody here from Rhode Island? Because I'm going to criticize Rhode Island. Rhode Island was never there. Rhode Island never showed up. Rhode Island didn't ratify the Constitution until after the Bill of Rights was ratified. Rhode Island was always like bringing up the rear. So, what happened? June of 1788, they adopted proposal, September of 1787, then it goes out to the states. In June of 1788, Virginia's convention ratified it, but there were conditions on that on their ratification. The condition was the first order of business that the Congress elected under the Constitution would be to draft a Bill of Rights. At least 4 of the other states in their ratification conventions imposed the same type of condition. George Mason, in September, hadn't persuaded anybody to vote against the Constitution. It was 39 for, 3 abstentions. Mason, a guy named Randolph from South Carolina, and Elbridge Gerry from Massachusetts, Gerry, who later, when he was the governor of Massachusetts, his name was used to describe the situation where legislative districts are drawn in a very crazy fashion. It was originally gerrymander, and at some point, I don't know when, that G became a soft G, and that's where we get the term gerrymander. So only 3 of the delegates voted to abstain, 39 voted yes, so it was adopted, went out to the states. But Mason's advocacy for this, and he wrote a pamphlet on this, and the one thing that surprises people when you talk about this early part of American history is that we had an incredibly literate society. Nearly everybody, certainly every citizen, and that would be free people, could read. And so the practice of writing, printing, and distributing pamphlets, or maybe 1-page things that got nailed up the walls, those were called broadsides. It was something that everybody was used to. Well, Mason just sent out another pamphlet, let's go read it. And so he persuaded a sufficient number of people to say, yeah, maybe he's right, maybe we do need a statement of our rights. To have these ratification conventions say, okay, we're convinced, when you assemble in New York, and that's where the capital was at the time, the first Congress assembles in New York, this is the first thing they're going to do. Constitution's ratified, goes into effect. Elections take place over the winter of 1788, 1789. The first Congress assembles in New York in the spring of 1789. And one of the members of the House of Representatives was our old friend James Madison. Ironically, he had run against his old friend James Monroe in a congressional election, and Madison won, so he's the one who shows up in New York as a member of Congress, and he brings with him, just as he had in 1787 in Philadelphia, a draft of what he felt, at this point, the changes in the Constitution should be, the amendments to the Constitution. Oh, sorry about that. All right, so they show up in New York, spring of 1789, and start drafting. Now, you may remember that the method of amending the Constitution, there are actually 2. The only one that's actually been used is one where a 2/3 majorities in each of the houses of Congress has to propose an amendment and vote for it. Then it goes out to the states, and 3/4 of the states have to ratify. The other method of amending, which thank goodness we've not had to deal with, but I'm afraid we might have to deal with in the near future, is a convention of the states. And we don't know exactly how that's going to. Okay, So what is the purpose of the original amendments? And you know, well, Bill of Rights, 10 amendments. Actually, there were 12 amendments proposed. The first 2 were not ratified by the states. The first of the amendments ratified was the 3rd proposal, and that is what became the First Amendment. So the First Amendment is not the First Amendment because it was the first in the set that went out to the states. It was actually number 3. It was the first one that was actually ratified. What's the purpose of the First Amendment and the rest of the Bill of Rights? It is to tell the federal government what it cannot do. Think of the Fourth Amendment. The government is not allowed to enter your home without a warrant, without presenting evidence to a judge saying, here's where we want to go, here is what we think we're going to find there, and it's evidence of a crime. Only after a judge has signed that, a search warrant, is the government allowed to enter your home. That's why today, the cop knocks on your door, you open the door, and he asks if you can come in, you can say no. What they do is they ask the question in such a way that it seems like you have no choice, but you do. If they don't have a search, actually, you answer his question with a question. Officer, do you have a search warrant? If the answer to that question is no, then you say, thank you very much, and you close the door. You have done nothing wrong. You've done nothing but exercise the rights that you have. And the policeman knows it. So it tells the government, at this time, the federal government, not the states, the federal government. Don't worry, all these amendments have been extended to the states. It tells them what they can't do, and it provides us a specific list of what our rights are. Something that is very useful. If you're like me, unless you see something in writing, you tend to kind of remember, well, I think I have this kind of right, but gosh, I haven't seen anything in writing. So that's one of the useful purposes. So, how does the First Amendment embody both of these? Telling the federal government what it can't do and telling you what your rights are. First 5 words again, Congress shall make no law. So what that's telling Congress, and by extension, the rest of the federal government. As you go through the rest of the First Amendment, those are things we can't do. We can't pass legislation, for example. And then the next 40 words tell us what our 6 rights are as protected by the First Amendment. So that's the purpose of this that provide us rights, the 4th, the 5th, the 6th, 7th, 8th, and so forth. Okay, so Congress meets, spring of 1789. Madison arrives with proposed amendments, but what he wants to do is simply do it by interlineation. He has a copy of the Constitution, and in the margins, he's got let's say, a clause, comma, and there's some words, a clause, and then he's got an arrow saying, drop this in here, or drop this sentence in there. Well, that's not going to work. And just like